no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain.
As the United Kingdom takes major steps to leave the European Union, British Prime Minister Theresa May vows to make a strong and decisive Brexit. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. The British Parliament debates plans to leave the European Union this week as steps towards a Brexit move forward. For the latest, CGTN's Richard Bestic joins us now from London. And Richard, this week the British Parliament is debating and voting on the first measures to allow Prime Minister Theresa May to trigger Article 50 that will enable the country to leave the European Union. What's the latest in Brexit and what's next?
Well, Anand, it has, depending on your view of Brexit, been the best of times and the worst of times. They're certainly extraordinary times going back over the last 6 months since that referendum. The country remains pretty much split down the middle on Brexit. Many still not reconciled to the idea that Britain is pulling out of the world's wealthiest and largest free trade area. And as you were saying there in Parliament, the irrevocable march towards Brexit continues, and it is irrevocable. Once the formal negotiations are underway, there's no going back. Members of Parliament are now voting on the legislation to allow the government to formally trigger those talks. But even getting that far was disputed. The government at first refusing to consult Parliament and only doing so reluctantly when Britain's 11 Supreme Court judges ruled against the UK Prime Minister Theresa May, who'd claimed she had ancient powers from the English Civil War that allowed her to use a royal prerogative against Parliament. It all sounds a bit Harry Potter, but the arguments are real enough. The Brexit debate inside the House of Commons, for example, has been colourful. Some dreading the long-term economic impact of Brexit, like a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Ken Clarke. His view: Britain's gone down the rabbit hole into a Brexit wonderland for a cup of tea with the Mad Hatter. The government says it's whether we trust the people or not. And all this, Anand, before Brexit's even really started.
So far, Richard, the response from the European Union has ranged from cautious to pretty hardline. What are you hearing from Brussels with these latest actions?
Well, in Brussels, it's been made very apparent that there'll be no change in the EU's position on the critical freedom of movement rules. It was those rules which brought so many largely Eastern Europeans to Britain's shores for work, placing real strains on UK health and housing. That EU position suggests the UK could be heading for tough talks. Britain's former ambassador to the EU, Ivan Rogers, saying the talks will be on a humongous scale, he says, with difficult trade-offs. There'll be name-calling and an extremely feisty atmosphere. And guess what? Anand, this is just the beginning.
Thanks, Richard. That's CGTN's Richard Bestic reporting from London. Joining us now from London, Joe Twyman is Head of Political and Social Research for Europe, the Middle East and Africa at YouGov, an international polling firm. And also from London, Hugo Dixon is a British journalist and founder and editor-in-chief of In Facts. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Joe, let me start with you. The British Parliament is expected to vote. There's a debate going on right now on this Brexit process, which will trigger off Article 50, which will enable Britain to withdraw from the European Union. That vote was ordered by the country's Supreme Court. Is that the last legal challenge standing in the way of Britain withdrawing from the European Union?
Well, that in itself is a matter of some debate. It has to clear the House of Commons, the lower chamber of the Parliament, but also the House of Lords, the upper chamber, before it can become law. And whereas the House of Commons looks like to be relatively smooth sailing thanks to a three-line whip and enforcement of the position of the Labour Party to support the triggering of Article 50. The House of Lords may be a different story. We don't know for sure yet. And so, whereas it's certainly approaching the last chance saloon for people wishing to remain, we're not there yet.
Hugo, this was
Can I come in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I, Anna, just, I think that This legislation is virtually certain to go through Parliament, but I wouldn't quite agree with Joe that that is the last chance saloon, because what this legislation does is it gives the Prime Minister the authority to trigger the process of leaving, which is then a 2-year process. It is possible, albeit I must say not very likely, that in that period the will of the British people will change. And if that was to happen, it is also possible, but not certain, that we could change our mind and still stay in the European Union. So it's almost the last chance saloon, but not quite.
Joe, do you think that is going to be acceptable to the Leave campaign? People have voted. Yes, it was a very narrow vote, 51.9% of those who voted deciding to leave the European Union. But could we get to a stage where public opinion changes, it shifts, there possibly is another referendum, and Britain could stay in the European Union?
Well, in theory, at least, once Article 50 is triggered, it then starts the clock with a 2-year deadline. And at the end of that 2-year deadline, we have to leave. Now, it may be debated on whether that would actually be the case. When you ask people what they think should come out of this process, what comes top in public opinion terms is that the result of the referendum is respected. And so that's what a majority of people think should happen. However, lots of things could change between now and then, not least with public opinion in this country, but also the situation in Europe. And I'll take each one of those in turn. When you look at public opinion in this country, the nature of the negotiation inevitably means that people will be disappointed with the outcome to some degree. If we could achieve full access to the single market, control of all our borders and an end to freedom of movement, no contributions to the EU at all, and full sovereignty over all our laws, then people would generally be happy, and the polling shows that. But that's not going to happen. Reality is going to bite, and it may bite hard. And so any kind of compromise beyond that that has to take place means that between around about 1/3 and 3/4 of the people who voted to leave are going to be disappointed. Add that to the 48% of people who voted to stay, and you've got a bit of a problem. But that's, of course, only in this country. In Europe, we have elections in the Netherlands, we have elections in France, we have elections in Germany just happening this year. It could be that unexpected or indeed even expected results in those countries bring about a change not just to the EU in those countries, but also the EU project generally. That means by the time we get to the end of 2.5 years, the situation is massively different from where we are at the moment. And the implications of that could be enormous.
Right. Hugo, does Joe have a point there? The people have voted, and the result of that vote should be respected, despite the fact that down the line there may be regret over that vote, there may be buyer's remorse of some kind, but right now the vote stands.
The vote does stand, and it must be respected. But in a democracy, the people do have an opportunity, in any democracy, they have an opportunity to change their mind. And I'm not predicting that they will change their mind, but if they do change their mind, and Joe has mentioned a whole series of things that might happen in the next couple of years that may be problematic in terms of these negotiations, I should also add that there may be things that happen on the geopolitical scene. I mean, the election of Donald Trump is already causing a bit of a backlash in Britain in many quarters. Who knows what that will how that will sort of reflect on the process. And we also don't know what's going to happen to the global economy. So when you put all of that together, there is a chance, I'm not saying a big one, right, that the people's views will change. But I just want to say that then the question is, will they be able to change their mind? And that critically depends on whether a deal is put to Parliament sufficiently soon for Parliament to come back with some alternatives. And that is, although I said earlier that this legislation currently going through Parliament will go through, and the Prime Minister will get an authority to trigger this article, these negotiations, there may be amendments attached to that legislation, crucial amendments that mean that Parliament stays involved throughout the course of this 2-year negotiating process.
Right. Hugo, there's something else we need to throw into the mix, and that is the view from Brussels, from Europe. And we're hearing very hardline statements coming out of Europe. The chief European Parliament negotiator, Guy Verhofstadt, he says there's no way back. We can't go soft on Britain. And he said that if that happens, if Britain doesn't leave, if there isn't a tough deal here, then the European Union is going to be seen as a doormat. He's not going to allow that to happen.
Well, I think that what is absolutely true is that the European Union is facing something close to an existential crisis. We know that the Eurozone economy, which Britain is not part of the Euro, but we know that that has been in crisis for, well, about eight years now. Yeah. And we also know that there's the migration crisis from the refugees from Syria, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Now we have Donald Trump in the White House, who is clear that he doesn't like the EU. Vladimir Putin doesn't like the EU. And then you've got Brexit. So they feel besieged all around. And their priority is to keep the EU together. And that does mean that they can't give us a deal which would look that it was better to be leaving the EU than staying in the EU. And so I do think that that means that it will be fairly tough negotiation.
Joe, why do you think the Europeans are being so hard on the United Kingdom as far as Brexit is concerned? You know, you get the feeling almost here that the Europeans want Britain to pay for this, Britain to pay for Brexit.
Yes, I think that's right. In essence, they're all thinking about their own elections in their own countries. They can't see leaving the European Union as a viable, let alone an attractive option for voters to aim for, because then it would undermine the support for the leading parties in European countries, and at the same time give credence and support to the kind of parties that adopt anti-EU positions, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Marine Le Pen and the Front National, the True Finns, the Swedish Democrats, the list goes on. And whereas Europe can afford, perhaps, to lose Britain off to the side of the continent, as it will, and wave goodbye to its membership of the EU, what it can't afford is for a France, a Germany, or even an Austria or Netherlands to cut themselves free as well.
One other complication, Joe, and that is the people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly during that referendum to stay in the European Union. Let's take a listen to what the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, had to say. Let's watch.
It's not just the case that the Tories are running towards Brexit. They want to drag Scotland kicking and screaming over that Brexit cliff edge, and I'm determined they're not going to get away with it.
So Scotland did have its own referendum on leaving the United Kingdom, and people voted that down. They stay with your United Kingdom. Are we going to see another Scottish referendum now? And if Scotland pulls out, then it stays with Europe. That's what the Scottish want.
Well, I think a referendum at the moment would be very unwise for the Scottish nationalists, because all of the polling suggests that they would lose. And this is despite the negotiations over Europe and the EU taking place. You see, the whole economic situation in Scotland has changed very much from the context in which it was taking place when the independence referendum took place. The price of oil has collapsed, and so the whole argument that they made in that respect is undermined. I think what will happen is that Scotland, or at least the Scottish nationalists, will wait to see what kind of deal has been struck, and at the same time wait to see what the polling on independence shows before holding a referendum. And it may be that further down the line this is something that happens, but I can't see it in the immediate future. What
is your view on that, Hugo? Do you think the Scots will go for a vote on independence, and that could complicate the withdrawal from Europe?
I agree with Joe that they're not going to go for it now. They'll wait until after we do a deal on leaving the EU, or we should never forget there is a significant possibility that the talks with the EU will get so fractious that we will actually crash out of the European Union without any deal at all. And I think after that happens, after Brexit, I think if it looks, particularly if we do have the crashing out of Europe scenario, I think that that would then trigger a recession in the UK, and the anger of the Scots would be immense. Now, I happen to think that it would be madness for the Scots to pull out of the UK, economic madness. But I also thought it was madness for the UK to pull out of the EU. And sometimes in these new world of populist politics, mad things happen. So I'm afraid, although I agree with Joe that this is not going to happen in the next 2 years, if you look on a sort of 5-year basis, we cannot rule out the possibility that Scotland will go for independence from the United Kingdom.
One other thing I want to ask you about, Hugo, and that is Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, was here in the United States last week. She talked of the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, and she also tried to lay the groundwork for some kind of free trade deal with the United States. But here again, the Europeans are having none of that. The European Foreign Policy Chief, Federica Mogherini, says Britain can't go ahead and negotiate bilateral deals with any other country while it is still a member of the European Union. It's really restricting Britain's negotiating room here. Let's listen to what Ms. Mogherini had to say.
As long as a member state is a member state, there are no negotiations bilaterally on any trade agreement with third parties. This is in the treaties, and this is valid for all member states as long as they remain member states until the very last day. I think this is fair for me to specify because this is a framework that we all share, including the United Kingdom in this moment.
So that is going to make it very tough for the United Kingdom to negotiate other deals, isn't it, Hugo?
I don't think it's quite as bad as it sounds. I mean, the whole question is when is a negotiation not a negotiation? Can we have talks with... I think what everybody agrees is that there's no way that we can conclude an agreement with the United States or, for that matter, any other country while we're still in the European Union. But I think that the idea that we can have preliminary discussions and we can sketch out some sort of agreement, I think that that should be possible. But I must say, I don't think that this is going to be a sort of pot of gold for Britain. I mean, when Donald Trump, who of course loves doing deals, is the whole art of the deal and everything, when he sees Theresa May, who's so desperate to see him, desperate to be the first foreign leader to visit him, he knows that if there is going to be a trade deal, it's going to be one that is going to be very much on America's terms. So I think we will have these talks. I think we'll have preliminary talks. Nothing will be concluded before we leave, but some deals will be concluded soon after, but they won't be very good, at least not very good for Britain.
Right, quickly, Joe, what do you think? Can the United Kingdom rather go ahead and make these kinds of deals that it wants to with the United States? Because we're hearing lots of different figures about how long these Brexit negotiations will take place. Some say 2 years, others say it could be as long as 10 years.
Well, I think there's two aspects to this. The first is the operational aspect, how long trade negotiations take. The fact that Britain has a lack of experienced trade negotiators. And so it's inevitable that this will be a difficult process. Plus, you could make the argument that America needs Britain, well, not very much. And Britain, on the other hand, is desperate for a relationship with America. And so that could be used as a bargaining position, as was mentioned. But then on the other hand, you have the direction in which public opinion is going. And it's not towards trade negotiations. Look at the trouble in this country that we had over TTIP and that transatlantic partnership agreement and the difficulties in getting that moving and getting support, widespread support in the British public. It was heavily undermined by the argument that all Americans wanted was access to the NHS. Look at Donald Trump's abolishing of NAFTA, or at least planned abolishing of NAFTA and withdrawal from that. The wind is not moving in the direction of trade negotiations and trade agreements in public opinion terms. If anything, it's moving towards protectionism. And that could have huge implications for any negotiations, discussions, however you want to characterise it, that take place.
OK, thanks to both of you for joining us. Joe Twyman, Hugo Dixon, both from London. Thank you. We are going to take a break right now. Coming up, The View from the European Union with a member of the European Parliament. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.